My daughter started acting like my house was hers, rearranging rooms, moving my things, treating me like an unwanted guest in the home I built from the ground up. I watched and said nothing, until one day she looked at me and said, "Can you move your stuff out of my way?" I am Warren, 70 years old, and this is the story of how I took my life back. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The morning air was crisp as I returned from my daily walk. The neighborhood was quiet, offering the kind of suburban peace I had worked 40 long years to secure for my family. But as I turned up my driveway, that hard-earned peace shattered completely. There, sitting in heavy wooden pieces on the curb next to the trash cans, was my mahogany bookshelf. I felt a cold knot form deep in my stomach. I built that bookshelf with my own hands 4 decades ago. I sanded every edge until it was smooth as glass, and stained the wood perfectly to match the living room where my late wife, Catherine, loved to sit and read her novels. It was not just a piece of furniture to me. It was a physical monument to the beautiful life we built together. I hurried inside the house. The front door was propped wide open, letting in the autumn chill. 2 men in dark delivery uniforms were wrestling a massive, sterile white entertainment center into the exact spot where my bookshelf had stood for 40 years. My daughter, Brooke, stood proudly in the center of the room. She was pointing and directing the workmen with a coffee cup casually held in her hand. She did not even look at me when I walked into the room. I watched in absolute horror as she picked up one of Catherine's first edition novels from a cardboard box on the floor and tossed it carelessly into a plastic donation bin. I stepped forward and demanded to know what she was doing to my home. Brooke finally turned to me and sighed, heavily rolling her eyes. She crossed her arms and boldly stated that the old furniture was giving the house a depressing atmosphere. She told me she could not invite her friends over with the place looking like a dusty museum of dead memories. Before I could process the sharp sting of her cruel words, her husband Jared walked into the living room. He clapped a heavy hand on my shoulder patronizingly, telling me I needed to embrace modernity. He squeezed my shoulder just a bit too hard and told me they were breathing new life into the old place. I looked at the pristine white shelves that held none of my precious memories. I looked at my daughter, whose cold eyes held absolutely no respect for the man who raised her. I said nothing. I walked slowly to the kitchen, silently setting the baseline of what they foolishly thought I would accept. The disrespect did not end with the living room furniture. It quickly seeped into every single corner of my home. A few nights later, Brooke and Jared hosted a noisy wine tasting for their friends. The house echoed with loud laughter and the annoying clinking of expensive glasses. I had spent the entire afternoon working in the garden and simply wanted to brew a quiet cup of chamomile tea to soothe my tired bones. I walked down the hall toward the kitchen. As I approached the doorway, I heard Jared holding court. He was loudly joking to his friends about the crushing burdens of elder care. He complained bitterly about the massive sacrifices they were making to look after me in my old age. The sheer audacity of his words made my blood run completely cold. I own this sprawling 4-bedroom suburban estate completely debt-free. I paid the property taxes every year. I paid the utility bills every month. They had moved in under my roof because they claimed they were struggling. Yet he was playing the noble martyr to his oblivious friends. I stepped into the kitchen. The laughter abruptly stopped, as if someone had cut a wire. Brooke rushed over to me, her face flushed with wine and sudden irritation. She grabbed my arm tightly and pulled me back into the hallway. She hissed that I was ruining the aesthetic of her sophisticated gathering. She explicitly asked me to stay locked in my bedroom for the rest of the evening, so her guests could relax without an old man hovering around. She treated me like a poorly behaved dog that needed to be put away when important company arrived. I felt a massive surge of anger burning in my chest, but I swallowed it down. I turned around and walked up the stairs to my room. I opened my bedroom door, seeking the last small sanctuary I had left in the world. I stopped dead in my tracks. Catherine's vintage vanity, the beautiful oak table where she used to brush her hair every morning, was gone from the corner of the room. In its place stood a massive, ugly garment rack overflowing with Brooke's designer coats and expensive dresses. Brooke had invaded my most private space to make room for her overflow wardrobe. My final sanctuary was breached. I walked over to the garment rack and touched the sleeve of a silk coat. The fabric felt icy cold against my skin. I sat heavily on the edge of my bed, listening to the arrogant laughter downstairs, realizing my own daughter was systematically erasing me from my own home. The physical erasure of my presence was only the visible symptom of a much deeper, more insidious rot. The following Tuesday, I walked out to the driveway to check the mail. Mixed in with the standard utility bills was a thick envelope from a premium credit card company addressed directly to Jared. The envelope was slightly torn at the corner, and as I pulled it out of the metal mailbox, the detailed statement slipped halfway out. I never intended to pry into their personal affairs, but the bold numbers printed on the paper caught my eye. The balance was absolutely staggering. Brooke and Jared had moved into my house 2 years ago under a very strict and clear pretense. They told me they were drowning in high rent payments and desperately needed a place to stay so they could save for a down payment on their own home. I welcomed them with open arms, wanting nothing more than to help my daughter build a stable future for her family. But the credit card statement in my trembling hands told a completely different story. The bill revealed thousands of dollars spent on luxury ski vacations in Aspen reservations, at 5-star restaurants, and massive charges from high-end boutique watchmakers. They were not saving a single dime for a house. They were using my blind generosity to fund a lavish lifestyle of pure extravagance. I took the bill inside and brought it straight to the breakfast table. Brooke and Jared were happily eating eggs I had bought with groceries I had paid for. I laid the statement gently on the table and calmly asked them how this massive debt fit into their responsible plan for a down payment. Brooke slammed her silver fork down on the plate. She threw an immediate vicious tantrum. Her face turned bright red as she loudly accused me of violating their privacy and snooping through their mail. She screamed that I was being financially controlling and that I had absolutely no right to monitor how they lived their lives. I reminded her softly that they were living rent-free under my roof specifically to save money. Jared pushed his chair back violently and stood up, towering over my seated frame. He coldly informed me that this 4-bedroom house was far too large for one fragile old man to maintain anyway. He looked down his nose at me and heavily implied they were doing me a massive favor by occupying the empty space and keeping the property alive. He completely dismissed my immense financial support, as if it were his birthright to bleed me dry. The final fragile thread of my tolerance snapped permanently later that same week. I desperately needed to clear my head from the constant suffocating tension inside the house. I decided to spend the afternoon out in my detached garage. It was my personal workshop, the only place where I kept my specialized woodworking tools and found true peace in the familiar smell of fresh sawdust. I walked across the backyard grass with my brass keys in hand. I slid my key into the heavy padlock on the garage door, but the metal cylinder would not turn. I pulled the key out and looked closer at the mechanism. The entire lock assembly had been completely replaced with a shiny new model. I stood there totally confused until Brooke walked out the back door of the house casually carrying a rolled-up pink yoga mat under her arm. I asked her why my key was no longer working for my own garage. She breezed right past me without a single care in the world. She casually informed me that she had hired a local locksmith to change the locks, because she had converted the entire space into her private yoga studio. She claimed my dusty tools were an ugly safety hazard. She walked over to the side of the garage building and picked up a small cracked plastic storage bin from the dirt. She shoved it roughly into my chest. I looked down at the box. Inside the plastic bin, jumbled together like worthless garbage, were my antique hand planes, my precision chisels, and my delicate measuring tools. They had been sitting out in the damp yard for days. Bright orange rust was already blooming across the fine steel blades that I had meticulously maintained for decades. Brooke told me to find somewhere else to put my junk. She turned her back on me, unlocked the new door to her studio, and walked inside. I stood alone in the damp grass, holding the ruined tools of my life. I did not yell at her. I did not throw the plastic bin. I simply gripped the sharp plastic edges until my knuckles turned stark white. This was the exact moment everything in my mind shifted. I realized with absolute clarity that I was no longer dealing with a misguided daughter who had simply lost her way. I was dealing with a malicious parasite who wanted everything I owned. I took the bin and walked slowly back to the main house. I had officially reached the very end of my tolerance. The time for fatherly patience was dead and gone. The time for silent observation and a ruthlessly calculated retaliation had officially begun. The atmosphere in my home shifted entirely on a Tuesday morning. I woke up to the heavy sound of foreign footsteps marching across the hardwood floors of my foyer. I stepped out of my bedroom to find a small army of strangers in crisp black and white uniforms moving through my house. They were carrying massive silver platters, towers of crystal wine glasses, and huge floral arrangements that smelled overwhelmingly sweet. Brooke was standing in the center of the hallway, holding a thick clipboard like a battlefield commander. She did not even bother to say good morning. Instead, she loudly announced to the bustling room that she had hired a professional catering team. She was hosting an exclusive high-stakes dinner party that evening for the senior corporate partners at the firm where her husband worked. Jared was apparently angling for a massive promotion, and they had decided my home was the perfect stage to fake a lifestyle of immense wealth and sophistication. Brooke spoke to me as if I were simply a slow-moving obstacle. She told me to stay out of the kitchen and avoid the main living areas so the staff could work their magic. I watched in total silence as the caterers carelessly banged heavy equipment against the hallway walls, completely ignoring the expensive paint I had meticulously applied just the previous spring. My home was no longer a sanctuary. It had been fully commandeered, transformed into a superficial prop for their endless greed. By early afternoon, the sky outside turned a bruised, angry shade of purple. Heavy, dark clouds rolled over the neighborhood, signaling a severe autumn storm. I was sitting quietly by the front window, doing my absolute best to remain invisible. Brooke marched aggressively into the room. Her high heels clicked sharply like gunshots against the floorboards. She stopped right in front of my chair and placed her hands firmly on her hips. She looked me directly in the eye and demanded that I move my 10-year-old sedan out of my own driveway. I was genuinely confused at first. I politely asked if the catering vans needed the extra space to unload the evening supplies. Brooke scoffed and rolled her eyes. She coldly instructed me to drive my car at least 3 blocks away and leave it parked near the old public recreation center. She crossed her arms and explicitly stated that the sight of my reliable, practical vehicle would completely ruin the upscale aesthetic she was trying to project. She actually used the word embarrassing. She looked out the window at the car that I kept in pristine running condition, the exact car that had safely carried her mother to countless hospital appointments, and called it an embarrassment. She claimed the corporate executives drove imported luxury vehicles, and the presence of my modest sedan would make them look like they lived in a low-class, undesirable neighborhood. The sheer breathtaking audacity of her demand hung in the air. They were actively using my multi-million-dollar property to trick strangers into thinking they were wealthy, and my perfectly functional car was threatening to expose their pathetic lie. I did not argue with her. Arguing with a parasite only validates their twisted sense of authority. I silently picked up my brass keyring from the side table and walked out the heavy front door. The wind was already howling viciously through the tall oak trees lining the street. I got into my car. The engine purred perfectly on the very first turn of the ignition, a testament to years of careful maintenance. I backed out of my own driveway and drove slowly down the hill, leaving my property behind. I found a spot along the cracked concrete sidewalk 3 blocks away, exactly as she had demanded. The exact second I turned off the engine, the angry sky completely opened up. A freezing, violent downpour began to lash relentlessly against my windshield. I had not brought an umbrella. Brooke had rushed me out of the house with such intense hostility that I had left my waterproof coat hanging by the door. I took a deep breath and stepped out into the freezing deluge. The long walk back up the steep hill was absolute physical agony. The icy rain soaked instantly through my thin flannel shirt, chilling my 70-year-old bones down to the very marrow. My knees and hips ached with every single step I took on the slippery pavement. Cars drove rapidly past me, splashing dirty street water against my trousers. I was a proud homeowner. I was a father. I was a man who had worked tirelessly for 50 years to build a secure fortress for his family. Yet here I was, trudging through the freezing mud like a discarded beggar, all because my own daughter was ashamed of my existence. I finally reached my front porch, shivering uncontrollably and gasping for warm air. I pushed open the heavy wooden door, desperately hoping to find a quiet corner to dry off. Instead, the house was a whirlwind of absolute chaos. The catering staff was rushing frantically back and forth, carrying trays of hot appetizers. No one even glanced at the freezing old man dripping dirty rainwater onto the expensive entryway rug. I walked past the formal dining room, which had been dressed up with absurdly pretentious centerpieces, and headed straight for the kitchen. I desperately needed to eat something to stabilize myself. My doctor had recently placed me on a very strict specialized diet to manage my dangerous blood pressure levels. I spent a significant portion of my limited fixed income having custom low-sodium medically tailored meals prepared and delivered every single week. They were incredibly expensive, but they were the medical fuel that kept me healthy and alive. I opened the large stainless steel refrigerator door. I froze in utter disbelief. The shelves were completely unrecognizable. The entire massive space was packed tight with chilled champagne bottles, exotic aged cheeses, and dozens of silver tins containing imported black caviar. I looked frantically across every single shelf for my small white nutritional containers. They were completely gone. A dark panic mixed with a deep burning anger as I turned around. I walked slowly over to the far corner of the kitchen, where the large plastic garbage bin stood. The heavy lid was propped slightly open. I leaned over and looked inside. There, buried under discarded vegetable peelings, bloody meat wrappers, and greasy plastic film, were my expensive dietary meals. They had not just been pushed to the back of the fridge. They had been thrown away like toxic waste. Brooke strolled casually into the kitchen at that exact moment, adjusting a vase of white roses. She saw me staring down into the garbage. She did not look guilty. She did not even blink. She casually tossed her hair over her shoulder and mentioned that the caterers desperately needed the refrigerator space to properly chill the caviar and the high-end seafood. She coldly suggested that I just order a cheap, greasy pizza for the night or eat some dry crackers from the pantry. She threw away the specialized food that literally kept my heart beating. The food I bought with my own hard-earned money simply so she could chill fish eggs for a room full of arrogant strangers. I stood there soaking wet, violently shivering from the cold rain, staring at my ruined meals. The silent baseline of disrespect had just crossed a massive, unforgivable boundary. This was no longer just about stealing my money or invading my space. They were now actively jeopardizing my physical survival for the sake of their own vanity. I slowly closed the garbage bin. The time for passive observation was officially over. The necessary trap had to be built, and it had to be completely devastating. The rain had finally stopped beating against the glass windows, but a bitter, unshakable cold had permanently settled into my bones. I spent the late afternoon locked inside my bedroom, listening to the muffled chaos of the caterers rushing through the hallways of my home. When evening finally arrived, I decided I would not hide in the shadows like a frightened animal. I was a man of pride, and I had worked my entire life to build this sanctuary. I walked over to my dark wood closet and pulled out my very best suit. It was a classic navy wool, expertly tailored, the exact suit I had worn to celebrate my 40th wedding anniversary with my late wife. I took my time getting dressed. I carefully buttoned my crisp white shirt and tied my silk tie with steady hands. I brushed my silver hair back, looking at my reflection in the mirror. I knew perfectly well that I was not welcome at their lavish dinner table. I had absolutely no intention of joining their pretentious gathering. My only goal was to walk quietly downstairs, slip unnoticed into the kitchen, to find a simple glass of water, and perhaps a slice of dry toast, and then return to my room with my dignity fully intact. When I opened my bedroom door, the house was completely unrecognizable to me. Soft, elegant jazz music floated up the main staircase, completely masking the familiar, comforting silence I had known for decades. The overwhelming scent of roasting meats, expensive wine, and heavy floral perfumes filled the warm air. I could hear the loud, confident voices and the sharp laughter of Jared's corporate friends echoing from the formal dining room. The bright lights of the grand crystal chandelier cast long, elegant shadows against the freshly painted walls. I began my slow descent down the main wooden staircase. I moved carefully, gripping the polished oak banister to steady my aching knees, taking one step at a time. I reached the midway landing, planning to take the narrow back hallway that led directly to the kitchen, hoping to completely avoid the guests and the hired staff. That was when Brooke stepped out from the hallway shadows, deliberately blocking my path. She was wearing a stunning, floor-length, emerald green gown that she had undoubtedly purchased using the money she had siphoned from my savings accounts. Her hair was professionally styled into an intricate updo, and heavy diamond earrings sparkled in the low light. She wore a bright, artificial smile meant for her guests, but that smile vanished the exact second her eyes landed on me. She scanned my tailored navy suit with absolute, undisguised disgust. It was as if my simple attempt to look dignified and presentable was a massive personal insult to her perfectly curated event. She did not say a single word of greeting. She did not ask how I was feeling after being forced out into the freezing rain. She simply thrust a battered, taped-up cardboard box directly into my chest. I instinctively raised my arms and gripped the rough cardboard to keep it from falling down the stairs. I looked down at the box resting heavily in my hands. Inside, carelessly jumbled together like items from a forgotten garage sale, were the most intimate and vital pieces of my daily existence. My bright orange prescription pill bottles, the essential heart medications that kept me alive, were loudly rattling against my delicate wire-rimmed reading glasses. Tucked roughly underneath the plastic bottles was a wrinkled pair of gray sweatpants, a faded cotton undershirt, and a pair of old wool socks. These were my private necessities tossed into a garbage box like useless, embarrassing clutter. I slowly raised my head and looked at my daughter, waiting for some kind of rational explanation for this absurd insult. She stepped closer to me, invading my personal space, purposefully lowering her voice so the wealthy corporate executives in the next room would not hear her cruel tone. She looked me dead in the eyes, with a chilling, hollow emptiness that I had never seen before. She did not look at me like a father. She looked at me like a piece of broken furniture that needed to be hauled to the dump. She took a breath and uttered the words that would permanently destroy our relationship. She asked, "Can you move your stuff out of my way?" I stood completely paralyzed on the landing. Before my tired mind could even begin to process the absolute breathtaking cruelty of her question, she delivered the final crushing blow. She casually waved her manicured hand toward the upper floor of the house. She whispered sharply that they desperately needed my master bedroom to store the heavy winter coats of their important guests. She told me the basement was already set up for me, my master bedroom, the spacious room with the large bay windows that overlooked the garden, the room where I had slept peacefully for 40 years, the room where Catherine and I had shared our deepest secrets, and the very room where she had taken her final, peaceful breath. Brooke was reducing the most sacred space in my entire world to a temporary coat closet for absolute strangers. And I, the man who had paid for every single brick and nail in this house, the man who had worked double shifts to buy her childhood toys, was being summarily banished to the cold, unfinished concrete subterranean floor. She did not ask for my permission. She did not offer an apology. She simply handed me my heart medication in a cardboard box and ordered me underground so her husband could impress his wealthy friends. The physical weight of the box in my hands suddenly felt like a massive granite tombstone. I realized in that terrible silent moment that the daughter I had raised was completely dead, replaced by a monster of pure, unadulterated entitlement. I stood frozen on the landing with the heavy cardboard box pressing against my chest. Before I could find the words to respond to the breathtaking cruelty of my daughter, the heavy wooden door of the formal dining room swung open. Jared walked out into the hallway. He was holding a crystal glass of expensive amber whiskey and laughing loudly at a joke told by one of his senior corporate partners. He looked incredibly comfortable in his tailored tuxedo, perfectly playing the role of the wealthy, generous host. His hair was meticulously styled, and his expensive leather shoes clicked sharply against the polished wood. His eyes flicked over to the landing and landed on me. He saw the battered cardboard box in my hands. He saw the crushed expression on my aging face. He did not ask what was wrong. He did not show a single ounce of empathy or respect for the father of his wife. Instead, a condescending smirk spread across his face. He leaned casually against the banister and spoke over the soft jazz music playing in the background. He told me to make sure I turned off the basement light when I went to sleep so I did not run up his electric bill. His electric bill. He was standing inside the 4-bedroom house I owned free and clear, drinking expensive liquor, paid for by the money he stole from my savings accounts, and he had the absolute nerve to lecture me about the cost of electricity. He clapped his wealthy colleague on the back and guided him back into the dining room, completely dismissing my existence as if I were a hired servant who had overstayed his welcome. I turned away from the warm glow of the main hallway. I carried the heavy cardboard box down the narrow corridor that led to the kitchen and stopped at the heavy wooden door of the basement. I reached out with a trembling hand and turned the cold brass knob. The door creaked open, releasing a rush of damp, freezing air that smelled heavily of old dust and wet concrete. The basement had never been finished. It was a raw, subterranean storage space meant for holiday decorations and old power tools. It was absolutely never intended for human habitation. I flipped the plastic switch at the top of the stairs. A single bare, incandescent bulb flickered on at the bottom, casting long, terrifying shadows against the rough cinder block walls. I began the slow, agonizing descent down the steep wooden stairs. Every single step groaned loudly under my weight. My knees ached terribly with the effort of balancing my tired body and the heavy box of my essential medications. I watched my breath turn into faint white clouds in the freezing underground air. With every painful step I took away from the warmth of the main floor, the lingering illusions of family loyalty evaporated completely from my mind. When my leather shoes finally hit the cold concrete floor, I took a long moment to look at the living arrangements my own flesh and blood had deemed suitable for me. Tucked away in the farthest, darkest corner of the basement, right next to the massive vibrating metal tank of the industrial water heater, was a miserable plastic air mattress. It was not even fully inflated. It sagged pathetically in the middle, resting directly on the freezing cement floor. A single thin gray blanket was tossed carelessly across the top. There was no pillow for my head. There was no bedside table for my reading glasses. There was no lamp to read by. There was only the harsh glare of the bare ceiling bulb and the deafening constant hum of the water heater churning out hot water for the wealthy guests upstairs. The air down here was thick with humidity and the smell of mildew. I walked over to the pathetic excuse for a bed and gently placed my cardboard box on the cold concrete. I sat down on the edge of the plastic mattress. It sank immediately under my weight, forcing my aching hips down against the hard, unforgiving cement. The bitter cold seeped instantly through my tailored wool trousers, sending violent shivers up my spine. I sat completely alone in the dim light and looked up at the exposed wooden joists of the ceiling. Directly above my head, the elegant dinner party was in full swing. I could hear the sharp clinking of heavy crystal wine glasses. I could hear the scraping of expensive wooden chairs against my pristine hardwood floors. I could hear the booming, arrogant laughter of Jared echoing directly through the floorboards. They were celebrating their fabricated success, literally dancing on the ceiling above the man they had buried alive in the dark. As I listened to the muffled sounds of their absolute indulgence, a profound and permanent shift occurred deep within my soul. The suffocating sadness that had choked me for months suddenly vanished. The confusion and the deep emotional hurt dissolved completely into the freezing basement air. I was no longer a disappointed father trying to understand a difficult child. I was no longer a grieving widower making endless excuses for a daughter who had lost her way. The physical exile to this damp concrete floor severed the final emotional cord binding me to them. I sat in the darkness and realized exactly what they were. They were not my family. They were hostile intruders. They were dangerous parasites who had infiltrated my fortress, drained my hard-earned resources, and banished me to the dungeons of my own castle. They believed my silence was a symptom of weakness and senility. They thought I was a broken, helpless old man who would simply lay down in the dark and wait to die while they spent the life savings I had bled for. They were entirely wrong. The quiet older man they thought they could easily manipulate was gone. I reached down and picked up my plastic bottle of heart medication. I gripped it tightly in my hands until my knuckles turned white. The time for sorrow was officially over. The time for passive observation had ended. I sat in the freezing basement and began to calculate exactly how to dismantle their lives piece by piece. Sleep was an absolute impossibility. The plastic air mattress offered zero comfort against the freezing concrete floor. For hours I lay there in the damp dark, listening to the heavy footsteps and muffled voices of the wealthy guests upstairs slowly fading away. Eventually, the front door clicked shut for the final time. The house fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Only the loud mechanical hum of the industrial water heater beside me remained. But my mind was wide awake. The shock of the evening had completely burned away my exhaustion. I sat up. My joints screamed in protest against the biting cold, but I ignored the pain. I needed to move. I needed to think. I stood up and pulled the thin gray blanket tightly around my shoulders. I began to pace the narrow length of the concrete floor beneath the single flickering light bulb. As I walked, my eyes adjusted to the dim shadows at the far edge of the basement. Pushed haphazardly against the damp cinder block wall was my old green metal filing cabinet. It was a heavy piece of office furniture I had owned for over 30 years. I used it to store my old tax returns, my property deeds, and the original blueprints of the house. Brooke had apparently shoved it down here when she decided my office upstairs would make a better walk-in closet. I walked over to the cabinet. The metal was icy to the touch. I pulled the top drawer open. The rusted metal tracks squealed loudly in the quiet basement. I simply wanted to look at my old documents to remind myself of who I was and what I had built. I ran my fingers over the familiar hanging folders. But as I reached the very back of the drawer, my hand brushed against something that did not belong. It was a thick, crisp manila folder. It was brand new and lacked the layer of fine basement dust that covered everything else. It was wedged awkwardly between 2 decades of my personal financial records. I pulled the heavy folder out and carried it directly under the harsh glare of the bare ceiling bulb. I flipped the cardboard cover open. Inside was a massive stack of official mail. Every single envelope was addressed entirely to me. Some of the postmarks were from months ago. Brooke had been systematically intercepting my personal mail and hiding it down here in the dark. My hands began to tremble as I pulled out the top document. It was printed on thick official paper bearing the embossed seal of the county probate court. I put on my wire-rimmed reading glasses and squinted at the dense legal text. The bold black letters at the top of the page made my blood run completely cold. It was a formal petition for adult conservatorship. I read the next line. It was a formal declaration of legal incompetence. Brooke and Jared had secretly filed paperwork with the county to have me declared mentally unfit to manage my own affairs. I turned the page and read the sworn affidavits attached to the petition. The sheer level of calculated manipulation made me physically sick to my stomach. Brooke had written a long, detailed statement describing my supposed rapid cognitive decline. She claimed I had become dangerously withdrawn and isolated. She completely omitted the fact that she was the one forcing me to stay locked in my bedroom and banning me from the main living areas. She described my quiet demeanor as severe apathy and early-stage dementia. She pointed to a minor incident where I temporarily misplaced my garden shears as absolute proof that I was a danger to myself. Every single time I had chosen to remain silent to keep the peace, she had maliciously documented it as a symptom of a rotting brain. They had weaponized my patience and turned my fatherly tolerance into a legal weapon to destroy my independence. I kept reading the terrifying documents. The final page outlined their ultimate legal goal. Brooke was petitioning the court to grant her full and absolute power of attorney over my medical and financial decisions. The paperwork explicitly requested the immediate authority to transfer the title of my 4-bedroom house directly into her name. The legal justification claimed this transfer was absolutely necessary to protect the asset and manage my future nursing home care. They were not just trying to steal my savings. They were methodically executing a legal strategy to completely strip me of my human rights. They wanted to erase my autonomy, take my home, and lock me away in a cheap facility while they lived like royalty on the fruits of my lifelong labor. I stood alone in the freezing basement, holding the paper evidence of my own planned execution. The profound sadness that had weighed me down all evening evaporated completely. It was replaced by a terrifying crystal-clear anger. They had drastically underestimated the man they were trying to bury. I was a retired logistics auditor. I spent my entire professional career hunting down corporate fraud, finding hidden numbers, and destroying complex lies. They thought my silence meant I was weak. They thought I was a fragile old man who would simply fade away without a fight. I carefully placed the documents back into the manila folder. I placed the folder safely back into the metal drawer and pushed it shut. I looked up at the wooden ceiling boards, knowing my enemies were sleeping soundly right above me. They had forced me into the dark, but they had made a fatal mistake. They had given me the exact weapon I needed to destroy them. The timeline was set. I had to act immediately before the court approved their fraudulent petition. I sat back down on the miserable plastic mattress and waited for the morning sun to rise. The war for my life had officially begun. The morning light did not reach the basement. I woke up with a stiff neck and a sharp pain shooting down my lower spine. The massive industrial water heater had finally stopped its deafening roar, leaving a heavy ringing silence in the damp underground air. I slowly pushed myself off the miserable plastic air mattress. Every single joint in my 70-year-old body screamed in loud protest against the freezing concrete. I smoothed the deep wrinkles out of my navy trousers and buttoned my suit jacket with stiff fingers. I refused to walk upstairs, looking like a broken, defeated victim. I climbed the steep wooden steps, one by one, gripping the rough handrail to steady my aching legs. I turned the cold brass knob and pushed the door open to the main hallway. The smell hit me immediately. It was a sickening, heavy mixture of stale champagne, rich cigar smoke, and rotting seafood left out to spoil. The house I had built and maintained for decades was an absolute disaster zone. The elegant dinner party had clearly devolved into reckless vandalism. Expensive crystal wine glasses were left half empty on my antique side tables, leaving deep white water rings permanently scarred into the polished wood. Cloth napkins heavily stained with dark red wine were tossed carelessly onto the cream-colored living room rug. I walked slowly into the kitchen and found an even worse scene waiting for me. Piles of dirty porcelain plates were stacked dangerously high in the stainless steel sink covered in hardened grease and leftover sauces. The professional caterers had obviously left in a massive hurry when their shift ended. They had abandoned half-eaten trays of imported caviar and expensive artisan cheeses on the beautiful granite countertops, allowing the luxury food to rot in the warm morning air. The kitchen floor was incredibly sticky with spilled liquor and crushed crackers. Upstairs, the house was completely and utterly silent. Brooke and Jared were sleeping deeply in my comfortable master bedroom, completely exhausted from a long night of pretending to be incredibly wealthy millionaires. A younger, more impulsive version of myself would have marched straight up those carpeted stairs and dragged them both out of my bed. I would have shouted until my voice went hoarse. I would have demanded they come down and clean up the disgusting mess they had made of my beautiful home. But the man who survived that freezing night in the basement knew much better. Anger is a loud, sloppy emotion that only warns your enemy of your next move. True strategy requires absolute, painful discipline. I took off my tailored suit jacket and folded it neatly over a wooden dining chair. I rolled up the sleeves of my crisp white shirt. I walked over to the sink and turned on the faucet, filling the metal basin with scalding hot water and heavy lemon dish soap. I began to wash their dirty dishes. I scrubbed the thick grease off their expensive plates with a coarse sponge. I carefully washed each delicate crystal glass and dried them with a clean cotton towel. I wiped down the long granite countertops until they shined perfectly in the morning sun, removing every single trace of their extravagant waste. I gathered the heavy plastic trash bags filled with their discarded luxury food and carried them out to the garage, making sure not to make a single loud noise that might wake them. I spent 3 solid hours meticulously restoring the entire main floor to a state of absolute perfection. I swept the hardwood floors, spot-cleaned the wine stains on the living room rug, and arranged the throw pillows perfectly on the sofa. I did this not out of a fatherly sense of love or obligation. I did this out of pure, calculated deception. I needed them to wake up and see a completely pristine house. I needed them to believe that their cruel psychological conditioning had worked flawlessly. By acting like a defeated, obedient servant who quietly cleaned up their messes, I was heavily feeding their massive egos. Arrogant people are always the easiest to blind. If I argued with them, they would put their guard up and watch my actions closely. But by becoming the submissive old man they desperately wanted me to be, they would stop paying attention to me entirely. They would assume they had completely broken my spirit, leaving me completely free to operate in the shadows without any suspicion. By 9 o'clock in the morning, the kitchen smelled beautifully of fresh citrus and clean linen. I dried my hands on a towel and rolled my sleeves back down to my wrists. I walked over to the kitchen island and pulled a small notepad from the top drawer. I picked up a black pen and wrote a very polite, highly subservient note. I told them I had cleaned up the party mess early so they could get some much-needed rest. I wrote that I was heading out to the local supermarket to buy them fresh groceries for the upcoming week. I signed it simply with the word Dad. I left the yellow piece of paper right next to the shiny espresso machine, where Jared would be absolutely guaranteed to see it the moment he came downstairs for his morning coffee. I put my suit jacket back on and grabbed my car keys from the brass hook by the front door. I stepped outside into the bright, crisp morning air. The severe rainstorm from the previous night had completely washed the suburban neighborhood clean. I walked 3 blocks down the quiet street to where my reliable sedan was still parked against the cracked concrete sidewalk. I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. The familiar hum of the motor was deeply comforting. I merged onto the main road, but I did not drive toward the local grocery store. I bypassed the shopping center completely and merged onto the highway, heading straight for the downtown financial district. The time for feeling sorry for myself was completely over. I was a retired auditor, and I knew exactly how to track a thief. My very first target was the main branch of my bank. It was time to see exactly how much blood these parasites had drained from my life. I parked my sedan in the massive concrete garage beneath the towering glass building of the First National Bank. The lobby was quiet and smelled of expensive floor wax and stale coffee. I walked directly past the teller line and approached the heavy mahogany door of the branch manager. His name was Mr. Palmer. I had known him for 15 years. He was a meticulous man who had helped Catherine and me set up our retirement accounts when I first left the logistics firm. He smiled warmly when I walked into his office, standing up to shake my hand. He asked me how I was enjoying my quiet retirement. I sat down in the leather chair across from his wide desk. I looked him straight in the eye and told him I needed a complete, unredacted audit of every single account tied to my Social Security number. Mr. Palmer lost his polite smile. He saw the cold seriousness in my eyes and immediately turned to his computer monitor. The rapid clicking of his keyboard filled the silent room. I asked him to start with the emergency savings account. This was a separate high-yield fund I had established a decade ago. It was specifically designed to cover catastrophic medical expenses or sudden home repairs. When my wife passed away, I made the terrible mistake of adding my daughter to the account as an authorized signer. It was a legacy safety measure. I wanted Brooke to have immediate access to the funds just in case I was ever hospitalized and completely incapacitated. I trusted my own flesh and blood with the keys to my safety net. Mr. Palmer stared at his glowing screen for a very long time. He took off his wire-rimmed glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked at me with deep pity. He quietly informed me that the emergency savings account was completely empty. The balance was absolutely zero. My chest tightened, but I kept my breathing perfectly even. I asked him to print the transaction history for the past 24 months. He handed me a thick stack of warm paper. I put on my reading glasses and let my old auditor instincts take complete control over my emotions. The pages documented a systematic, ruthless financial slaughter. The withdrawals started small, a few $100s here and there, precisely timed around the months Brooke and Jared first moved into my house. But as time went on, the amounts grew massively. There were heavy wire transfers to luxury car dealerships. There were exorbitant payments to high-end travel agencies. There were countless daily withdrawals at expensive retail boutiques. They had treated my emergency medical fund like an unlimited personal checking account. They had completely drained $80,000 of my hard-earned money to fund their shallow, pathetic lifestyle. I placed the stack of papers carefully on the edge of the wooden desk. I did not raise my voice. I simply asked Mr. Palmer to freeze the empty account to prevent any overdraft charges. He nodded quickly, typing the command into his system. But his hands were trembling slightly. He looked incredibly uncomfortable. He cleared his throat and asked me if I had any questions regarding the final paperwork for my property. I stared at him in complete confusion. I owned my house completely free and clear. There was absolutely no outstanding paperwork. I asked him exactly what he was talking about. Mr. Palmer turned his monitor around so I could see the screen. He pulled up a massive digital document file. It was a formal application for a home equity line of credit. It was a massive loan taken out against the total appraised value of my 4-bedroom house. The requested amount was a staggering $250,000. The loan was secured entirely by the deed to my property. If the money was not repaid, the bank would legally foreclose on my home and throw me out into the street. I leaned forward and looked closely at the digital signature at the absolute bottom of the heavy application. It was my name perfectly spelled out in blue ink, but it was not my handwriting. The loops on the letters were far too wide. The pressure of the pen was completely wrong. It was a highly calculated, expertly practiced forgery. Brooke and Jared were not satisfied with simply draining my savings and locking me in the freezing basement. They were actively leveraging the entire value of my home to secure a massive cash payout for themselves. They were planning to take the $250,000, likely to fund their master suite renovations and their extravagant lifestyle, while leaving me entirely responsible for the crushing monthly debt payments. If they succeeded with the conservatorship petition I had found in the basement, they would have total legal control over the stolen money and the house, leaving me completely destitute and trapped in a cheap care facility. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. I asked Mr. Palmer what the exact status of the loan application was. He checked the internal banking system notes. He told me the underwriters had already approved the credit check. The property appraisal had been completed using a drive-by valuation. The application had officially cleared the final review process just yesterday. I asked him the most important question of my entire life. I asked him when the massive funds were scheduled to be released to the joint checking account. Mr. Palmer typed another command. He looked up at me with grave concern. He stated that the disbursement of $250,000 was scheduled to occur in exactly 14 days. 14 days. 2 short weeks. That was the exact amount of time I had left before the bank handed my enemies the financial power to completely destroy my life. If that money cleared the system and landed in their greedy hands, recovering it would take years of agonizing civil litigation. I would lose my home. I would lose my dignity. I would lose absolutely everything I had spent 50 years building. The timeline was no longer an abstract concept. It was a ticking bomb placed directly under my chair. I looked at the forged signature on the glowing screen. I thanked Mr. Palmer for his time and asked for a physical copy of the forged loan application. I folded the heavy papers and placed them securely inside my suit jacket right next to my pounding heart. I walked out of the bank and into the bright morning sun. The shock was completely gone. I had exactly 14 days to dismantle their entire world. I needed an architect of destruction. I needed the most ruthless lawyer in the city. I did not drive back to the quiet suburbs. I merged onto the busy interstate and navigated my sedan deeper into the heart of the city, heading straight for the towering glass skyscrapers that housed the most dangerous predators in the corporate world. When an older man is betrayed by his family, society expects him to hire a gentle, soft-spoken family law attorney. They expect comfortable mediation sessions filled with boxes of tissues, tearful apologies, and desperate attempts at reconciliation. I had absolutely zero interest in mediation. I did not want a hollow apology from a daughter who had thrown my heart medication onto a freezing concrete floor. I wanted complete and utter annihilation. I parked my car in an expensive underground garage and took the gold-plated elevator up to the 50th floor of a prestigious legal firm. I was there to see a man named Sullivan. He was not a family lawyer. He was a ruthless estate litigator who had spent his entire professional career hunting down corporate embezzlers and dismantling massive financial fraud rings. He was a legal assassin. I had exactly enough money left in my private retirement portfolio to hire him, and I was ready to spend every last penny to buy my freedom. The young receptionist led me through a set of heavy mahogany doors into a massive corner office. The room featured floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entire sprawling city skyline. Sullivan was sitting behind a thick slab of polished black marble that served as his desk. He was a sharp, intimidating man in his late 50s, with cold gray eyes and a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. He stood up and gestured for me to sit down in the heavy leather chair opposite him. He looked at my silver hair and my slightly stooped posture. He probably expected a fragile, weeping old man who was heartbroken over a minor family misunderstanding. I did not shed a single tear. I sat down with absolute perfect posture, calling upon every ounce of discipline I had learned during my decades as an auditor. I reached inside my suit jacket and pulled out the thick stack of documents I had gathered. I laid the forged home equity loan application precisely in the center of his black marble desk. I placed the empty bank statements revealing the stolen $80,000 right next to it. Finally, I placed the county conservatorship petition on top of the pile. I did not give him a long, emotional speech about how much I loved my daughter or how deeply her betrayal hurt my soul. I simply pointed to the papers and told him the exact timeline. I told him we had exactly 14 days before they successfully stole $250,000 and used the court system to lock me in a medical prison. Sullivan picked up the documents in total silence. He read through the forged signature analysis, scanning the bank withdrawals with the sharp eye of a seasoned predator. He spent a long time reading the absurd claims of dementia in the county petition. The silence in the large office was heavy and electric. When he finally looked up, his gray eyes had completely changed. He was no longer looking at a helpless victim. He was looking at a fellow architect of destruction. He leaned back in his leather chair and steepled his fingers together. He spoke in a low, measured voice. He told me that most clients in my position ask him to draft a strongly worded cease and desist letter. They want to send a warning shot to scare their greedy children into behaving properly and backing away. I looked him dead in the eye and told me I did not want to send a warning. A warning simply gives the enemy valuable time to hide their weapons, destroy evidence, and change their legal strategy. I told Sullivan I wanted to build a financial guillotine. I wanted a trap so sudden and so devastating that they would never even see the blade falling. Sullivan smiled. It was a cold, terrifying smile that let me know I had absolutely hired the right man for the job. We spent the next 3 hours mapping out a legal and financial trap so flawless that it would leave them completely destitute. The very first step of our plan was protecting my remaining assets from their grasping hands. Sullivan immediately began drafting the complex paperwork to transfer the legal title of my 4-bedroom house and all my remaining personal wealth into an impenetrable, irrevocable blind trust. By doing this, I would no longer technically own anything under my own name. When they finally went to court to activate their fraudulent conservatorship, they would find that they had gained legal control over a ghost. The estate would be entirely controlled by an independent trustee, making their legal victory completely useless. But the true devastating masterstroke of our meeting came when we discussed the massive fraudulent bank loan. My initial instinct was to call the bank manager, immediately cancel the entire application, and protect my property from the terrible debt. Sullivan held up his hand and stopped me. He told me that stopping the loan right now would only result in a minor slap on the wrist. Brooke and Jared would simply claim it was a huge misunderstanding, that I had given verbal permission and forgotten about it due to my old age. They would escape justice entirely. Sullivan leaned forward and told me to let the massive loan application proceed to the very final stage. He wanted the bank to process the paperwork. He wanted them to officially confirm the wire transfer. The exact second that fraudulent $250,000 attempted to cross state lines and hit their joint checking account, it would instantly trigger federal felony wire fraud charges. If we stopped them today, they might walk away totally free. If we waited exactly 14 days and let their greed take the wheel, they would walk directly into a federal prison cell. I felt a deep chill run through my veins, followed immediately by a massive wave of absolute powerful peace. I nodded my head in agreement. The trap was perfectly set, and the bait was in place. I stood up and shook his hand firmly. All I had to do now was go back to my house, step down into the freezing basement, and play the role of the obedient broken father until the heavy blade finally dropped. I drove back into the quiet suburban neighborhood with a trunk full of fresh groceries and a heart perfectly hardened against the 2 people living inside my house. I carried the heavy brown paper bags through the front door and set them carefully on the spotless kitchen counter. The house was awake now. I could hear the television playing softly in the living room. I began unloading the items one by one. I placed the fresh fruit in the ceramic bowl and lined up the expensive organic vegetables in the refrigerator. Brooke walked into the kitchen wearing a luxurious silk robe. She did not thank me for cleaning the massive mess from her party. She did not ask how my morning walk was. She walked directly over to the grocery bags and pulled out the bag of dark roast coffee beans I had purchased. She held the bag up to the light and let out a loud, exaggerated sigh of pure frustration. She looked at me with total disdain and complained that I had bought the completely wrong brand. She told me the beans were too acidic and that she only drank the imported artisanal blend from the specialty shop downtown. Yesterday, that level of ungratefulness would have broken my heart. Today, it was exactly what I needed. I looked at my daughter and summoned the most pathetic, apologetic expression I could possibly muster. I let my shoulders slump forward slightly. I offered a warm, submissive smile. I apologized profusely for my careless mistake. I told her my old eyes must have misread the label on the shelf. I offered to drive straight back to the store and exchange the coffee immediately so her morning would not be ruined. Brooke waved her hand dismissively, clearly thrilled by my immediate surrender. She told me not to bother ordering me to just brew a fresh pot of the cheap beans and try not to burn the water this time. She turned around and walked back to the living room to join her husband. I turned to the shiny espresso machine and began to prepare their morning coffee. I set out the delicate ceramic mugs. I placed a small plate of fresh pastries on a silver serving tray. I carried the tray into the living room like a hired butler. Jared did not even look up from his glowing tablet when I set his hot coffee down on the glass table. He simply grunted in acknowledgement. I asked them if the temperature of the room was comfortable. I asked if they needed anything else to make their morning more relaxing. I played the role of the defeated, subservient old man to absolute perfection. They drank the coffee and ate the food I provided, completely blinded by their own massive egos. They firmly believed my spirit was totally broken. They thought the cold night in the basement had finally taught me my place at the bottom of their hierarchy. They had absolutely no idea they were sitting in the very center of a heavily armed trap being served by the man holding the detonator. As I quietly wiped down the kitchen counters for the second time that day, my mind drifted back to my long professional career. For 40 years, I worked as a senior logistics auditor for a massive international shipping corporation. My entire job consisted of walking into chaotic warehouses, reviewing massive ledgers, and finding exactly where the missing money went. I tracked stolen inventory across global supply chains. I found hidden numbers that arrogant corporate executives had desperately tried to bury in complex spreadsheets. I spent decades building airtight dossiers that sent highly educated white-collar criminals to federal prison. Tracking a forged bank loan and a stolen $80,000 from a local checking account was absolute child's play compared to the massive corporate frauds I had dismantled in my prime. Brooke and Jared thought I was just a tired old woodworker who planted tomatoes in the backyard. They had completely forgotten the ruthless professional skills that had paid for the very roof over their heads. I maintained the sickening facade of the smiling, obedient servant for the entire day. I cooked their dinner. I washed their plates. I agreed with every single insulting comment they made. When the sun finally set and they retired to my master bedroom, I walked back down the steep wooden stairs into the freezing basement. The exact second my feet hit the cold concrete floor, the pathetic smile vanished entirely from my face. I was no longer the subservient father. I was the auditor, and it was time to work. I turned on the single flickering light bulb and sat down on the miserable plastic air mattress. I pulled the heavy manila folders from the metal filing cabinet. I laid the bank statements, the forged loan application, and the fraudulent county conservatorship petition out on the cold floor. I spent the long, freezing hours of the night building a flawless binder of evidence for Sullivan. I used a red pen to circle the exact dates of the illegal bank transfers, cross-referencing them with the dates Brooke claimed I was losing my mind. I built a perfect timeline proving their premeditated financial crimes. I attached the physical copies of the forged signatures next to copies of my actual handwriting from old tax returns. I did not leave a single stone unturned. I anticipated every single lie they might tell the authorities, and I systematically dismantled those lies with hard, undeniable paper evidence. The cold basement air did not bother me anymore. The humming water heater faded into the background. I was absolutely focused on the pure mathematical destruction of my enemies. They thought they had buried me in the dark. They did not realize that the dark was exactly where I did my very best work. I closed the thick evidence binder just as the sun began to rise. Everything was perfectly prepared. The trap was fully loaded. All I had to do was wait for them to make their final fatal miscalculation. The days following my meeting with Sullivan blurred together into a sickening routine of domestic servitude. I woke up before the sun every single morning to prepare their breakfast. I ironed the expensive dress shirts belonging to Jared and folded the designer gym clothes belonging to Brooke. I polished the hardwood floors until they shined like glass, and I tended to the flower garden they never bothered to look at. My absolute compliance acted like a powerful, intoxicating drug on their massive egos. They became completely consumed by their own perceived authority. They stopped lowering their voices when they talked about my house. They stopped hiding the expensive bags from their daily luxury shopping trips. They genuinely believed that the freezing night in the dark basement had permanently broken the spirit of the old logistics auditor. They completely mistook my calculated silence for a cowardly, pathetic surrender. Exactly 1 week before the massive bank loan was scheduled to clear, Brooke walked into the kitchen carrying a heavy roll of thick white paper. I was standing at the stainless steel sink, meticulously peeling potatoes for their evening meal. The kitchen smelled of fresh herbs and roasting meat. She dropped the heavy paper roll onto the smooth granite island. It made a loud, authoritative smack that echoed through the room. She unrolled the large pages and pinned the curling corners down with heavy crystal salt shakers. I dried my hands on a clean kitchen towel and walked slowly over to see what she was looking at. Spread out across my counter were highly detailed architectural blueprints of my entire second floor. Brooke did not even bother to look up at me. She dragged her manicured finger across the bold blue ink lines representing the walls of my home. She announced in a bright, excited voice that she and Jared had finally hired a high-end residential contracting firm. They were going to start massive renovations to bring the outdated house into the modern century. She pointed her finger directly to the thick line separating my beautiful master bedroom from the adjacent guest room. She casually informed me that the contractors were going to take heavy sledgehammers to that specific wall and knock it down completely. They were going to combine the 2 large rooms into one massive luxury master suite, complete with an enormous walk-in closet and a custom marble soaking tub. She was actively planning to violently destroy the physical structure of the quiet sanctuary I had shared with my late wife for decades. I kept my face entirely blank. I let my shoulders drop forward perfectly, playing the part of the confused, helpless father. I politely asked her where I would sleep once the loud construction started upstairs and the dust covered my old room. I asked if I should temporarily move my small bed into the small office down the hall. Brooke finally looked up from the architectural plans. She stared at me as if I had just asked the most incredibly stupid question in the entire world. She let out a sharp, condescending laugh that cut right through the warm kitchen air. She crossed her arms tightly across her chest and explicitly told me that the basement was my new permanent residence. She stated that the upstairs office was going to be converted into a private home gym so Jared could work out in the mornings. She looked me dead in the eye and said that a frail old man did not need natural sunlight or a comfortable bed anyway. She ordered me to stop complaining about my situation and be eternally grateful they were letting me stay in the house at all. The sheer breathtaking audacity of her statement hung heavy in the room. She was standing inside the very house I owned entirely debt-free, holding expensive blueprints paid for by the money she had stolen from my emergency savings account. She was gleefully planning to rip down the solid walls I had built and maintained with my own hard-working hands. And she was permanently banishing me to a freezing concrete floor next to a loud, rumbling water heater for the rest of my natural life. I looked down at the blue lines on the paper, letting my eyes trace the destructive plans. I swallowed my pride and asked her in a quiet, highly submissive voice when the heavy demolition was scheduled to begin. Brooke smiled a wide, greedy smile that showed all of her teeth. She proudly announced that the general contractor and his entire heavy demolition crew were scheduled to arrive at 8 o'clock in the morning on the second Tuesday of the month. She said it was going to be a massive celebration of their new elevated lifestyle. I felt a sudden, powerful electric shock run completely through my veins. My heart began to pound heavily against my ribs, but I absolutely refused to let a single emotion show on my aging face. The second Tuesday of the month. I quickly did the complex math in my head. That was the exact same day the fraudulent $250,000 home equity loan was scheduled to clear the final banking underwriting process. That was the exact day the stolen funds would automatically deposit directly into their joint checking account, instantly triggering the severe federal wire fraud charges Sullivan and I had carefully prepared for. They had unknowingly aligned their moment of ultimate arrogant triumph with the exact moment of their absolute devastating destruction. They were going to start swinging sledgehammers into my walls on the very day the heavy metal blade of the financial guillotine was scheduled to fall on their necks. It was a beautiful, poetic convergence of pure greed and inescapable consequence that I could never have planned better myself, even if I had tried. I looked up from the blueprints and looked directly into the cold, empty eyes of my daughter. I did not argue with her. I did not shed a single tear over the permanent loss of my bedroom or the extreme cruelty of my permanent exile to the underground concrete floor. I simply offered her a warm, compliant, utterly defeated smile. I nodded my head obediently and told her that a luxury master suite sounded like a truly wonderful idea for a young, successful couple. I told her I would gladly stay out of their way down in the dark basement so they could freely build the beautiful life they truly deserved. Brooke beamed with absolute triumph, completely satisfied with her total and permanent domination over my life. She rolled the thick blueprints back up, tucked them proudly under her arm, and walked happily into the living room to share the fantastic news with her husband. I turned back to the stainless steel kitchen sink and picked up my small paring knife to resume peeling the potatoes. My hands were perfectly steady. My breathing was slow and calm. The final fatal miscalculation had officially been made. The stage for the grand climax was completely and perfectly set. They were happily planning a morning of arrogant demolition, completely unaware that I had spent the last 2 weeks building a perfectly inescapable federal prison around them. I looked out the clear kitchen window into the bright afternoon sun. I only had 7 short days left in the dark. The second Tuesday of the month arrived with a bright and completely cloudless sky. It was exactly 8 o'clock in the morning when the heavy diesel engine of a massive construction truck shattered the quiet peace of our suburban street. I stood near the kitchen window and watched as a crew of burly men in bright yellow reflective vests piled out of the vehicle. They began unloading heavy sledgehammers, canvas drop cloths, and large industrial crowbars onto my pristine green lawn. The sheer volume of the noise they made was incredible. They were laughing loudly and tossing metal tools into the back of a rusted wheelbarrow. Inside the house, the atmosphere was absolutely electric with anticipation. For Brooke and Jared, this was the glorious morning their massive luxury renovation was finally beginning. For me, it was the exact morning the heavy steel blade of the financial guillotine was scheduled to drop directly onto their arrogant necks. I remained perfectly calm. I watched the construction foreman march up my concrete driveway, holding a thick clipboard filled with the expensive work orders my daughter had authorized using the money she planned to steal from my name. I walked slowly from the kitchen to the base of the main staircase to observe the enemy camp. I looked up and saw Brooke standing in the middle of the second-floor landing. She was entirely absorbed in her own vanity. She was wearing perfectly clean designer athletic clothes that looked like they had never seen a single drop of sweat. She was holding her expensive smartphone high in the air, actively taking dozens of selfies with the wall of my master bedroom in the background. She puckered her lips and posed dramatically, making sure to capture the exact spot where the contractors were about to swing their heavy sledgehammers. I could hear her recording short video clips for her social media accounts. She happily announced to her internet followers that she was finally upgrading her living space and getting rid of the depressing old energy in the house. She was actively celebrating the violent destruction of the room, where my late wife Catherine and I had built our entire life together. She treated the demolition of my personal sanctuary as nothing more than a fun weekend project for her online audience. She did not even glance down at the stairs to see if I was watching her. She was completely blind to everything except her own glowing reflection on the digital screen. The sharp, bitter smell of dark espresso beans pulled my attention back to the first floor. I turned around and walked back toward the kitchen where Jared was holding court. He was leaning casually against my granite countertops, holding a tiny white ceramic cup in one hand and his smartphone in the other. He was speaking incredibly loudly on a business call, bragging to one of his junior corporate colleagues about the massive renovations. He boldly claimed that upgrading the property was just a small drop in the bucket for his vast financial portfolio. He actually laughed and told the person on the phone that real estate was all about maximizing square footage and aggressively eliminating dead space. I knew exactly what he meant by dead space. He meant me. He meant my memories. He meant the entire 50 years I had spent working to provide for his wife. He was drinking coffee I had brewed, standing in a kitchen I had paid for, bragging about a massive bank loan he had fraudulently secured by forging my signature. His absolute arrogance was breathtaking. He took a long sip of his espresso and glanced over at me. He did not say good morning. He simply snapped his fingers and pointed to the empty pastry plate on the counter, silently ordering me to fetch him another baked good. I did not react with anger. I simply nodded obediently and handed him a fresh blueberry muffin, feeding his delusion of absolute control. I did not want to be wearing a servant uniform when the trap finally snapped shut. I left the kitchen and walked quietly into the small downstairs bathroom to change my clothes. I reached into the canvas garment bag I had secretly hidden behind the door the night before. I pulled out a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit. Catherine had bought me this exact suit 10 years ago for a special anniversary dinner. It felt like a suit of heavy armor slipping over my shoulders. I buttoned the crisp white shirt and adjusted my silver silk tie until it was perfectly straight. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror. The tired, defeated old man who had slept on the freezing concrete floor was completely gone. The logistics auditor who dismantled corporate empires was fully back in control. I stepped out of the bathroom and walked toward the heavy wooden front door just as the loud doorbell began to ring. The contractors were ready to enter. Brooke came rushing happily down the stairs to greet them, her face glowing with pure excitement. She stopped for a brief second when she saw me standing by the door wearing my best formal suit. She looked slightly confused, but her massive ego quickly brushed it off as the eccentric behavior of an old man. She casually asked me where I thought I was going, dressed like that on a Tuesday morning. I placed my hand firmly on the cool brass doorknob. I looked her right in the eyes and offered a very polite, calm smile. I told her the house was going to be far too noisy for me today. I told her I was simply going for a long, quiet walk to stay completely out of their way. Brooke waved her hand dismissively and told me not to come back until the heavy dust settled. I opened the door, stepped out into the bright morning sun, and walked slowly down the driveway. I was not going for a walk. I was safely clearing the blast zone. I stood at the end of the street watching the heavy construction trucks idling in my driveway. The loud rumbling of the diesel engines echoed through the quiet neighborhood. Through the large bay window of the living room, I could clearly see the foreman handing a thick metal clipboard to my daughter. Brooke was holding a shiny silver pen. She was smiling brightly, ready to sign the official work order that would authorize the violent destruction of my home. The burly men in yellow vests were already standing near the stairs with their heavy sledgehammers resting on their shoulders. They were simply waiting for the ink to dry on the paper. I checked the silver watch on my left wrist. It was exactly 8:15 in the morning. Just as Brooke lowered the pen to the paper, a long black town car pulled smoothly to the curb directly in front of my house. The heavy doors opened in perfect unison. Sullivan stepped out onto the concrete sidewalk. He was wearing an immaculate dark suit that made him look like a sleek predator entering a cage of careless mice. Flanking him on either side were two massive private process servers dressed in matching dark suits. They walked straight up my driveway, completely ignoring the loud construction equipment. They did not bother to knock on the heavy wooden front door. It was already propped wide open for the work crew. Sullivan and his men walked right into the middle of the crowded living room. I moved slowly up this driveway, standing just outside the open door to listen. Inside the house, the loud chatter of the contractors suddenly died down. Sullivan possessed the kind of terrifying cold authority that instantly commanded absolute silence in any room he entered. He walked directly up to the foreman and held up his hand. He ordered the man to cease all demolition activity immediately. Brooke was standing right there with the silver pen still hovering over the clipboard. She looked at Sullivan with deep annoyance. She rudely demanded to know who he was and why he was interrupting her scheduled renovation. Sullivan did not even look at her. He kept his cold gray eyes locked entirely on the construction foreman. Sullivan pulled a thick stack of legal documents from his leather briefcase. He handed the papers directly to the foreman. He spoke in a very calm, highly measured voice that carried perfectly through the silent house. He informed the contractor that the property they were standing in no longer belonged to Warren. He stated that the entire estate had been legally transferred into an irrevocable blind trust several days ago. He warned the foreman that if a single sledgehammer touched a single wall of the house, the construction company would face immediate and devastating civil lawsuits for felony property destruction. The foreman looked down at the official court seals on the papers. He was a smart man who wanted absolutely no part of a massive legal battle. He immediately turned to his crew and ordered them to put their heavy tools down on the floor. He handed the metal clipboard back to Brooke, refusing to let her sign the work order. Brooke finally lost her temper. Her face turned a bright, angry shade of red. She stepped in front of the foreman and yelled at Sullivan. She told him he was completely insane and that she was the one in charge of the property. She bragged that she had filed official paperwork with the county to take over my affairs because I was suffering from severe dementia. She confidently claimed that I had absolutely no legal right to transfer the house to anyone. Sullivan slowly turned his head to look at my daughter. He did not raise his voice. He simply handed one of the dark-suited process servers a separate stack of papers. The large man stepped forward and placed the documents directly into her hands. Sullivan calmly explained the brutal reality of her situation. He told her that my medical records had been fully verified by 3 independent doctors proving I was completely of sound mind. He explained that the county conservatorship petition she had filed was entirely useless because there were absolutely no assets left in my name to manage. The blind trust owned the house and an independent legal trustee managed the trust. He told her she was standing in a house she did not own, trying to destroy walls she had no right to touch. He looked her up and down with absolute disgust and told her the renovations were permanently canceled. The foreman told his men to pack up the canvas drop cloths and load the wheelbarrow back into the truck. They walked right past me on the front porch, eager to escape the heavy tension. Jared walked into the living room, holding his tiny espresso cup. His arrogant swagger faltered slightly when he saw the official state seals on the documents Sullivan had brought. He asked Brooke what was going on in a highly nervous tone. Brooke looked down at the complex legal documents in her hands. She read the bold black print and saw the undeniable stamps from the state. But her massive ego simply refused to accept defeat. She looked up at Sullivan and let out a loud, arrogant laugh. She truly believed this was just a pathetic, desperate bluff organized by a helpless old man. She threw the legal papers carelessly onto the granite kitchen counter. She crossed her arms and smugly told Sullivan that he was wasting his time. She proudly announced that they had total financial control over the situation, regardless of who owned the building. She looked at Jared and smiled, telling him there was absolutely nothing to worry about. She told Sullivan that the bank was releasing a massive $250,000 loan to them that very morning. She arrogantly claimed that with that kind of money, they could hire their own high-powered lawyers to crush this pathetic little trust fund stunt and reinstate the renovations. She reached into the pocket of her expensive athletic pants and pulled out her smartphone. She confidently dialed the direct number to the main branch of the bank. She wanted to put the loan officer on speakerphone to prove to everyone in the room that she was the absolute master of the house and that the massive funds had finally cleared. I stood quietly on the front porch and listened as the phone began to ring. The first domino had been pushed over. The heavy steel blade of the financial guillotine was hovering directly over them, and she was willingly placing her own neck squarely on the block. The quiet hum of the speakerphone filled the tense air of the kitchen. Brooke stood tall and defiant by the granite island. She had placed her expensive smartphone right in the center of the counter for everyone to hear. Sullivan stood completely still, with his hands folded neatly in front of his tailored suit. Jared shifted his weight from one foot to the other, holding his empty ceramic espresso cup. I remained outside on the front porch, listening carefully through the open doorway. The phone rang 3 times before a crisp, professional voice answered the line. It was a senior loan officer from the main branch of the bank. Brooke did not offer a polite greeting. She immediately launched into an arrogant, demanding speech. She proudly stated her name and told the representative she was calling to verbally confirm the final wire transfer of her massive home equity line of credit. She spoke slowly and loudly, treating the bank employee like a slow child who needed simple instructions. She demanded to know the exact hour the $250,000 would be completely available in her joint checking account so she could pay her construction crew. The bank representative did not apologize for the delay. The voice on the other end of the speakerphone dropped an octave, turning incredibly cold and entirely clinical. The officer informed Brooke that the requested loan had not been processed. Brooke rolled her eyes and let out a loud, exasperated sigh. She angrily asked if there was a minor clerical error with the routing numbers. The bank representative stated firmly that there were absolutely no clerical errors. The representative explained that the entire massive loan application had been permanently frozen by the Bank Fraud Prevention Department early that morning. The word fraud hung in the warm kitchen air like a thick, heavy fog. Brooke lost her arrogant smile. She leaned closer to the phone and demanded an immediate explanation. She claimed there was a massive misunderstanding and threatened to move all her business to a different bank if the money was not released that very second. The representative remained completely unbothered by her empty threats. The voice through the speakerphone clearly outlined the brutal reality of the situation. The bank officer stated that the loan application was flagged for severe and deliberate forgery. The final signature on the heavy paperwork did not match the official records on file. Because the massive loan request involved federal banking institutions and crossed state lines, the attempted transaction was automatically classified as severe felony wire fraud. Brooke opened her mouth to argue, but the bank representative was not finished delivering the devastating news. The officer informed her that the massive property she was trying to borrow money against no longer belonged to the name on the fraudulent application. The bank system showed that the entire estate had been legally and permanently transferred into an irrevocable blind trust exactly 3 days ago. The bank representative explained that an independent legal trustee had proactively contacted the bank security department and locked down every single asset connected to my name. Brooke stood completely frozen. Her manicured hands began to tremble violently. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking pale and suddenly very small. But the financial guillotine had not finished its deadly work. The bank representative continued reading from the heavily documented file. The officer stated that a complete forensic audit had been conducted on the joint emergency savings account the previous week. The internal audit clearly showed a long, systematic pattern of unauthorized withdrawals totaling exactly $80,000. The representative informed Brooke that the missing money had been officially reported as stolen funds. The bank had already frozen her joint checking account and forwarded the entire financial dossier directly to the Federal Financial Crimes Division for immediate criminal prosecution. The bank representative calmly advised Brooke to retain a criminal defense attorney before terminating the call. The line went completely dead. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the beautiful kitchen. Brooke stared blindly at her expensive phone. Her brain simply could not process the absolute destruction of her entire reality. She had gone from a wealthy property owner planning a massive luxury renovation to a federal criminal suspect with completely frozen bank accounts in a matter of 5 short minutes. She looked up at Sullivan, hoping he would tell her this was all a terrible, elaborate joke. Sullivan simply looked back at her with eyes as cold as jagged ice. He did not say a single word. He did not have to. The bank had just executed his flawless plan to absolute perfection. The heavy ceramic espresso cup slipped from the hands of Jared and shattered violently into dozens of sharp pieces against the hardwood floor. The loud crash broke the spell in the room. Jared stumbled backward away from the kitchen counter as if the granite island had suddenly caught fire. His entire successful corporate persona instantly evaporated into thin air. He was a senior executive at a massive financial firm. His entire career, his six-figure salary, and his professional reputation were built entirely on his pristine background checks and his flawless credit standing. He knew better than anyone else in that room exactly what severe federal wire fraud charges meant. He knew the bank was not making idle threats. A felony indictment for stealing $80,000 from an elderly man and attempting to forge a $250,000 property loan meant immediate corporate termination. It meant he would lose his licenses. It meant he would face years in a federal penitentiary. Jared began to hyperventilate. He grabbed his own hair, pulling at the perfectly styled roots. He turned his wide, terrified eyes toward his wife. He did not offer her comfort or support. The united, arrogant front they had maintained for months crumbled instantly under the crushing weight of real legal consequences. He pointed a shaking finger directly at Brooke. He began to scream that this was entirely her fault. He yelled that she was the one who told him the old man was completely senile. He screamed that she had guaranteed the massive bank loan was perfectly safe and that I would never even notice the missing money. He looked at the shattered pieces of his cup on the floor and realized his entire privileged life was completely over. He realized the quiet old man they had banished to the freezing basement had mathematically and systematically destroyed their entire future without ever raising a single finger in anger. The heavy steel blade had finally fallen, and their arrogant empire was completely severed at the neck. I walked slowly through the front door and stepped over the heavy wooden threshold. The loud, arrogant energy that had completely filled my house just 10 minutes ago was entirely gone. It had been replaced by a suffocating, thick terror. I walked down the short hallway and stepped into the beautiful kitchen. The shards of the broken ceramic espresso cup were scattered across my expensive hardwood floor. Jared was leaning heavily against the granite island, breathing in short, rapid gasps. Brooke was staring blankly at her expensive smartphone. Neither of them moved when I entered the room. They simply stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice a single octave. I stood tall in my tailored charcoal suit and buttoned my jacket. I looked at the two parasites who had tried to bury me alive, and I finally broke my long, calculated silence. I spoke with absolute, quiet authority. I told them that the era of their pathetic delusions was officially over. I listed the exact numbers with the cold precision of a senior logistics auditor. I told Brooke that I knew she had systematically drained exactly $80,000 from my emergency medical fund over the course of 24 months. I told her I had copies of every single unauthorized wire transfer she made to fund her luxury vacations and her designer wardrobe. I listed the massive payments she had sent to the expensive ski resorts in Aspen. I listed the exact amounts she had spent at the high-end jewelry boutiques downtown. I watched the blood drain completely from her face as I recited the exact dates of her worst financial offenses. I turned my attention directly to Jared. I told him I knew absolutely everything about the massive fraudulent home equity line of credit. I stated the exact date and the exact hour they had electronically forged my signature on the heavy bank documents. I told him I had already surrendered the physical copies of the forged applications to the Federal Financial Crimes Division. I explained that the bank had frozen the transaction completely and handed the evidence over to the federal authorities. Jared squeezed his eyes shut and let out a pathetic, whimpering sound. He knew the absolute mathematical certainty of his own destruction. He slumped down against the expensive granite cabinets, sliding slowly until he hit the floor. He buried his face in his trembling hands. He was no longer the arrogant corporate executive bragging about his massive wealth. He was a terrified criminal facing the absolute end of his privileged existence. I continued to deliver the brutal facts without a single ounce of mercy. I explained the exact legal penalties for elder financial abuse in our state. I told them that stealing from a vulnerable adult carried severe mandatory minimum prison sentences. I explained that forging a signature to secure a $250,000 loan across state lines constituted federal wire fraud. I told Jared his entire corporate career was permanently over. I told him the strict financial regulatory boards would strip him of his professional licenses before the criminal trial even began. I told him the wealthy friends he had entertained in my formal dining room would abandon him the exact second the felony indictments became public record. I told them both they were going to lose absolutely everything they had ever valued. The crushing weight of reality finally shattered the massive ego of my daughter. Brooke realized that her arrogant threats and her cruel intimidation tactics were completely useless against the solid wall of federal evidence I had built around her. She immediately abandoned her posture of superiority. She resorted to the very last weapon she had left in her pathetic arsenal. She attempted to use emotional manipulation. Her eyes filled rapidly with large, heavy tears. Her lower lip began to tremble violently. She took a step toward me and fell to her knees on the hard wooden floor right next to the shattered pieces of the espresso cup. She reached her shaking hands out toward my tailored suit. She looked up at me with a desperate, pleading expression. She cried out loudly and called me Daddy. That specific word hung in the air like a foul poison. It was a word she had not used since she was a little girl. She only used it now because she was cornered like a desperate rat. She sobbed heavily and begged me to call the bank and stop the lawyers. She told me she was incredibly sorry, and that the massive stress of the planned renovations had simply clouded her judgment. She cried that she never actually meant to hurt me. She tried to remind me of the days when she was a little girl playing happily in the backyard. She tried to invoke the sacred memory of her late mother, Catherine. She begged me to remember that we were a family, and that family always forgives. It was a spectacular theatrical performance of pure, desperate victimhood. A few months ago, those fake tears would have completely broken my heart. I would have rushed forward to pick her up and comfort her. But the man who survived the freezing, dark basement felt absolutely nothing for the weeping woman on the floor. I looked down at her shaking shoulders. I remembered the exact moment she handed me my essential heart medication in a cardboard box and ordered me underground. I remembered the plastic garbage bin filled with my medical meals. I remembered the cold, arrogant laugh she gave when she gleefully planned to destroy my bedroom. The fatherly love I once held for her had been completely starved and beaten to death by her own endless greed. I took a slow, deliberate step backward, ensuring her grasping hands could not touch my clothes. I looked down at her with eyes completely empty of warmth or forgiveness. I spoke in a voice as cold and hard as concrete. I told her to stop crying. I told her she had absolutely no right to speak the name of her mother. I told her Catherine would be completely sickened by the monster she had become. Brooke sobbed louder and reached for me again, begging her father to save her from the police. I raised my hand and cut her off completely. I delivered the final absolute truth that severed our bond forever. I looked her dead in the eyes and stated that I had no daughter. The heavy words echoed loudly through the silent kitchen. Brooke froze completely, her mouth hanging open in pure shock. The fake tears stopped flowing instantly. She finally understood that the bridge back to my heart was permanently burned to the ground. She realized that the quiet, submissive old man was a carefully constructed illusion. I was the architect of her absolute ruin, and I was completely immune to her pathetic manipulation. I turned my back on her and walked over to stand next to Sullivan. The emotional confrontation was permanently over. The only thing left for them to face was the devastating arrival of the authorities. The heavy silence in the kitchen was suddenly broken by the sharp wail of approaching sirens. The sound started as a faint echo in the distance, but rapidly grew louder until it filled the entire neighborhood. I walked away from my weeping daughter and stood by the large bay window in the living room. Two sleek police cruisers pulled aggressively into my driveway, completely blocking the rusted wheelbarrow left behind by the construction crew. Bright red and blue emergency lights flashed intensely, casting harsh-colored shadows across my pristine green lawn. The heavy doors of the cruisers swung open. 4 plainclothes detectives wearing dark windbreakers with gold badges clipped to their belts stepped out onto the concrete. They did not look like ordinary street patrol officers. They moved with the cold, calculated efficiency of men who spent their lives hunting down serious corporate criminals. Sullivan walked up to stand beside me at the window. He checked his silver watch and nodded in quiet satisfaction. He had precisely timed the arrival of the Financial Crimes Division to coincide perfectly with the exact moment the bank finalized their internal fraud report. Heavy footsteps echoed loudly on my front porch, followed by 3 massive, authoritative knocks on the wooden door. I did not move to answer it. Sullivan stepped forward and opened the door wide, welcoming the detectives into my home. The lead detective, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a serious expression, stepped into the foyer. He asked for Jared and Brooke by their full legal names. Jared stumbled out of the kitchen looking like a moth walking to his own execution. His expensive tailored shirt was soaked with nervous sweat. Brooke followed closely behind him, still wiping the fake tears from her ruined makeup. The lead detective did not offer them a polite greeting. He pulled a thick stack of folded legal papers from his jacket pocket. He spoke in a loud, booming voice that left absolutely no room for negotiation. He informed them he was executing immediate federal arrest warrants for severe wire fraud conspiracy to commit bank fraud and felony elder financial abuse. He stated that the authorities had already secured the forged loan documents and the audited bank statements proving the theft of $80,000. The sheer absolute reality of the criminal warrants struck Jared like a physical blow to the chest. The arrogant corporate executive who had laughed at me just an hour earlier completely vanished. In his place stood a pathetic, desperate coward willing to do absolutely anything to save his own skin. 2 officers stepped forward and ordered Jared to turn around and place his hands behind his back. The loud metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists echoed through the living room. That sharp sound completely broke his mind. Jared violently twisted his body toward Brooke and began screaming at the top of his lungs. He told the detectives that he had absolutely nothing to do with the forged signature. He pointed his cuffed hands at his wife and yelled that she was the sole mastermind behind the entire operation. He frantically claimed that Brooke handled all the household finances and that she had explicitly lied to him about having my permission to take the money. He begged the officers to check the computer network addresses, swearing that Brooke was the one who submitted the fraudulent application. He threw the woman he supposedly loved directly under the heavy wheels of the federal justice system without a single second of hesitation. Brooke stared at her husband with an expression of pure, absolute hatred. The unified front they had proudly displayed for months crumbled into a disgusting pile of toxic betrayal. Another detective stepped forward and grabbed her arms, pulling them behind her back. As the cold steel cuffs locked around her wrists, Brooke unleashed a furious, unhinged scream. She spat violently in the direction of Jared. She yelled that he was a pathetic, weak liar. She screamed to the detectives that Jared was the one who desperately wanted the massive master suite because he was deeply insecure about his corporate image. She confessed loudly that Jared had personally coached her on exactly how to drain the emergency savings account in small increments so it would not trigger any bank alarms. She told the police that Jared had threatened to divorce her if she did not secure the massive property loan to fund his lavish lifestyle. They stood in the middle of my beautiful living room, wearing heavy steel handcuffs, viciously tearing each other to completely shred to save themselves. The profound loyalty they claimed to share was completely exposed as nothing more than a shallow, parasitic arrangement based entirely on mutual greed. I stood perfectly still next to the polished antique table and watched their miserable empire burn to ashes. I felt absolutely no pity for either of them. They had spent months treating me like a worthless burden, casually planning to strip away my dignity and lock me in a freezing basement. Now they were the ones completely stripped of their freedom and facing the terrifying cold reality of a federal prison cell. The lead detective calmly instructed his officers to remove the suspects from the premises. The officers grabbed Jared and Brooke by the arms and forcefully marched them toward the open front door. Jared was openly weeping, his expensive leather shoes dragging heavily across the hardwood floor. Brooke was still screaming vicious insults at him, her face completely twisted in ugly, bitter rage. They were paraded out of the house in full view of the quiet suburban street. The bright morning sun illuminated their absolute humiliation for all the neighbors to clearly see. I watched through the open door as the officers pushed them roughly into the back seats of the separate police cruisers. The heavy doors slammed shut, sealing their dark fate. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the windows of my house, signaling the permanent end of their reign of terror. I took a deep breath of the fresh morning air, filling my lungs with the sweet, intoxicating taste of absolute victory. The flashing emergency lights of the police cruisers illuminated the terrified faces of Brooke and Jared as they stood completely paralyzed by the open car doors. Before the officers could push them into the back seats, Sullivan stepped out onto the concrete front porch. He held 2 thin manila envelopes in his right hand. He nodded to the lead detective. The detective ordered the officers to hold the suspects right where they were. Sullivan walked down the concrete driveway with the cold precision of a legal executioner. He stopped right in front of Brooke and Jared. He did not yell or gloat over their absolute ruin. He simply slid the brown envelopes into their trembling hands. He informed them in a perfectly measured voice that the papers contained an emergency protective order and a 0-day notice of eviction. He explained that because they had engaged in severe federal financial crimes while residing under my roof, the trust had the absolute legal right to terminate their residency immediately without a standard 30-day notice. Furthermore, the restraining order explicitly barred them from coming within 500 feet of me or the property ever again under penalty of immediate incarceration. The lead detective turned to them and explained the strict conditions of their departure. They were not going to central booking, completely empty-handed, but they were also not taking the valuable contents of my house with them. The detective told them they had exactly 30 minutes to go back inside and pack 1 single small duffel bag of basic clothing. They were strictly forbidden from taking any expensive jewelry, any luxury electronics, or any items purchased with the stolen funds from my medical account. Everything else was officially seized as material evidence or property of the blind trust. The officers temporarily removed the steel handcuffs to allow them to pack, but flanked them tightly on both sides to prevent any sudden movements or destruction of evidence. Jared and Brooke walked back up the concrete driveway. They looked like entirely different people. Their arrogant posture was completely shattered. Their shoulders were deeply slumped, and they kept their eyes glued to the pavement. They walked past me in the foyer. I did not move an inch. I stood like a stone statue in my tailored charcoal suit, watching them drag their heavy feet up the main wooden staircase. For the next 30 minutes, the beautiful house was filled with the pathetic sounds of their frantic and humiliating packing. I stood at the bottom of the stairs and listened carefully to the complete destruction of their massive egos. I could hear Brooke sobbing hysterically as a female officer firmly ordered her to leave a massive designer fur coat hanging in the closet. I could hear Jared quietly begging a male officer to let him take his expensive collection of boutique watches. The officer loudly refused, stating the watches were bought with stolen money and were now federal criminal evidence. They were forced to leave behind the beautiful silk dresses, the tailored tuxedos, and the expensive modern electronics they had prioritized over my own human dignity. The officers meticulously checked every single item they tried to put into their canvas bags. They were only allowed to pack plain sweatpants, basic cotton shirts, and cheap sneakers. They were packing for a cold jail cell, not a luxury ski resort in Aspen. The absolute reality of their impending poverty was finally sinking in. The $250,000 they thought they had secured was gone. The $80,000 they had stolen was being tracked by the federal government. They were leaving my house with absolutely nothing but the cheap clothes on their backs. When the 30 minutes were completely up, they walked slowly back down the stairs. Each of them was carrying a single cheap canvas gym bag. They looked completely pathetic and utterly broken. Brooke had ruined her expensive makeup with her endless tears. Jared looked like a terrified shell of a man, his face pale and his hands shaking uncontrollably. They walked toward the heavy wooden front door for the very last time. The police officers followed closely behind them, ensuring they did not try to grab anything on their way out of my home. As they stepped out onto the front porch, they had to walk past the large plastic trash cans at the edge of the driveway. Sitting right next to the garbage, exactly where Brooke had carelessly ordered the delivery men to throw it a few weeks ago, were the heavy wooden pieces of my antique mahogany bookshelf. The beautiful wood I had sanded and stained for my late wife was sitting in the bright morning sun, ruined by the rain from the previous night. Brooke stopped for a brief second and looked down at the broken pieces of my history. I saw the sudden flash of absolute realization hit her tired eyes. She finally understood the incredible magnitude of her fatal mistake. She had treated my life and my precious memories like worthless garbage, and now she was being thrown out into the street like the morning trash. I walked out onto the porch and stood at the top of the concrete steps. I looked down at the two parasites who had tried to bury me alive in a freezing basement. Jared did not look back. He kept his head down and walked directly to the police cruiser, fully accepting his miserable fate. Brooke turned around one last time. She opened her mouth as if she wanted to say something, perhaps to offer one final desperate apology to the man who had given her everything. I simply raised my hand and pointed a single finger directly toward the waiting police cars. The officers grabbed her arms and pushed her firmly into the back seat. The heavy metal doors slammed shut with a loud final thud. The lead detective shook my hand and thanked Sullivan for the incredibly organized evidence binder. The two police cruisers slowly backed out of my driveway and drove away down the quiet suburban street. The flashing red and blue lights disappeared around the corner. I stood on the porch and listened to the peaceful morning silence slowly return to my property. The heavy steel blade had completely severed their toxic grip on my life. The house was finally entirely my own again. I watched the taillights of the police cruisers disappear around the bend of the quiet suburban street. The flashing emergency lights faded completely into the distance, leaving nothing but the bright morning sun reflecting off the wet asphalt. I stood on my front porch for a long time. I listened to the birds chirping in the tall oak trees. The heavy, suffocating tension that had choked this property for 2 long years had vanished entirely into the crisp autumn air. I turned around and walked back through the heavy wooden front door. I pushed the door shut, and the heavy brass latch clicked perfectly into place. I was completely alone. The house was finally empty. I took a slow, deep breath and began to walk through the rooms of the first floor. I walked into the kitchen. The morning light poured through the large bay window, illuminating the shattered pieces of the ceramic espresso cup Jared had dropped on the hardwood floor. I walked over to the kitchen island and picked up the thick roll of architectural blueprints Brooke had proudly displayed just a few days ago. I carried the heavy paper roll over to the large plastic trash bin and dropped it inside. I swept up the broken ceramic pieces and threw them away. I wiped down the beautiful granite countertops one last time, erasing the final physical traces of their arrogant morning routine. I left the kitchen and slowly climbed the main wooden staircase. The stairs did not feel like a forbidden path anymore. They felt like a stairway leading back to my own peaceful life. I walked down the second-floor hallway and pushed open the door to my master bedroom. The room was a chaotic mess of discarded designer clothes and open drawers. Brooke and Jared had left their expensive wardrobes scattered across the premium rug in their frantic rush to pack for jail. I ignored their luxurious garbage. Instead, I looked closely at the walls. The contractors had used thick blue chalk to draw heavy demolition lines across the expensive paint. They had marked exactly where the heavy sledgehammers were supposed to strike. I reached out and ran my bare hand over the blue chalk. I felt a profound sense of relief. The walls of my sanctuary were completely safe. The house had survived the violent invasion, but simply surviving was not enough. I needed to completely restore my home to its original glory. I walked back downstairs to my quiet study and picked up the telephone. I did not call a basic cleaning service. I called a professional moving and restoration crew. I needed strong men with the right equipment to undo the terrible physical damage my daughter had casually inflicted on my property. The crew arrived less than an hour later. They were a team of 4 polite and hard-working young men. I led them straight to the backyard and unlocked the new door to the detached garage. Brooke had converted the space into her private yoga studio, but her pink exercise mats and expensive mirrors meant absolutely nothing to me now. I ordered the men to tear up the mats and carry them out to the curb. I pointed to the heavy wooden vanity that belonged to my late wife, Catherine. Brooke had shoved it into a dark corner of the garage, burying it carelessly under boxes of useless seasonal decorations. The young men carefully lifted the beautiful oak table and carried it back across the green lawn. I followed them up the stairs and directed them to place the vanity in the exact corner of the master bedroom where it had always belonged. Next, I walked over to the damp grass near the side of the garage. I knelt down and picked up the cracked plastic storage bin, holding my specialized woodworking tools. The fine steel blades of my hand planes and chisels were heavily covered in bright orange rust. I carried the heavy bin back into the newly cleared garage. I placed the tools carefully on my solid wooden workbench. I knew it would take me weeks of meticulous sanding and oiling to bring the steel back to life, but I finally had all the time in the world. The tools were back in their proper home, and my hands were eager to begin the hard, satisfying work of true restoration. By late afternoon, the restoration crew had finished their heavy lifting. They had carried the ruined pieces of my mahogany bookshelf from the driveway into my garage, where I planned to carefully rebuild it, piece by piece. They had bagged up all the expensive designer clothes Brooke and Jared had left behind and placed the heavy black trash bags in the storage shed until the federal authorities decided what to do with them. I paid the young men generously for their hard work and thanked them for giving me my home back. They drove away, leaving me completely alone in the absolute quiet of the approaching evening. I walked back into my master bedroom. The setting sun cast long, warm shadows across the polished hardwood floor. I walked over to Catherine's vintage oak vanity and ran my hand over the smooth wood. I pulled out the small matching wooden stool and sat down. I looked at my own reflection in the clear glass mirror. I looked older. The deep lines on my face showed the heavy toll of the last 2 years. But my eyes were bright and my shoulders were perfectly straight. I sat in the beautiful room and listened to the house. For months, the silence in this building had been incredibly oppressive. It was the heavy, terrifying silence of a man forced to hide in the shadows of his own life. It was the silence of biting my tongue, swallowing my pride, and waiting in the freezing, dark basement. But the silence I heard now was completely different. It was pure. It was peaceful. It was the magnificent, victorious silence of a man who had successfully defended his castle and permanently banished the greedy traitors from his land. I took off my tailored charcoal suit jacket and hung it neatly in my large closet. I laid down on my own comfortable bed for the first time in what felt like an eternity. I closed my eyes and let the beautiful, victorious silence wash over me, knowing with absolute certainty that I would never have to sleep on a freezing concrete floor ever again. 6 months passed since the flashing police lights faded from my quiet suburban street. Winter had come and gone, and the heavy snow had finally melted away to reveal a bright and promising spring. I was sitting on my back patio enjoying a warm cup of coffee and the absolute peace of my restored garden when my cell phone rang. It was Sullivan. He called precisely at 10 o'clock in the morning, punctual and professional as always. He did not call to discuss my estate planning. The blind trust was operating perfectly, and my assets were completely secure. He called to give me the final legal update on the two criminals who had once occupied my home. I took a slow sip of my dark roast coffee and listened to the cold, hard facts of their new reality. Sullivan started with Jared. The federal justice system moves slowly, but corporate America moves with absolute ruthless speed. The exact morning the felony wire fraud indictment became public record, the massive financial firm where Jared worked completely severed all ties with him. He was not given a polite severance package or a quiet opportunity to resign. He was escorted out of his towering glass office building by armed security guards carrying his personal belongings in a small cardboard box in front of all his peers. The strict financial regulatory boards immediately revoked his professional trading licenses. He was permanently banned from the wealthy industry he had dedicated his entire life to. Sullivan informed me that Jared was currently awaiting his federal criminal trial while living in a cheap motel near the industrial highway. His wealthy corporate friends, the exact same men who had laughed in my formal dining room while drinking expensive liquor, had completely abandoned him. He was entirely radioactive. His massive ego and his desperate need to project a luxurious lifestyle had ultimately cost him his freedom, his reputation, and his entire future. Then Sullivan moved on to my daughter. Brooke had managed to avoid immediate federal prison time by completely turning against her husband, cooperating with the federal prosecutors, and agreeing to a devastating plea deal. As part of her strict criminal probation, she was legally required to pay back every single penny of the $80,000 she had stolen from my emergency savings account. The money was ordered to be paid directly in heavy monthly installments to the blind trust. Sullivan described her current living situation in vivid detail. The arrogant woman who had loudly complained that my sprawling 4-bedroom estate was entirely too small and depressing was now renting a cramped, windowless studio apartment on the absolute worst side of the city. Because Brooke now possessed a severe felony record for financial theft, no reputable corporate office would ever hire her. She was currently working 40 hours a week at a minimum wage retail job. She spent her days standing on her tired feet, stocking shelves, and cleaning up messes for the exact type of working-class people she used to openly despise. She was giving up her entire paycheck just to earn enough money to meet her strict court-ordered restitution payments. She was living the exact life of poverty and grueling manual labor she had always believed she was entirely too good for. The absolute irony of her punishment was a perfect reflection of her incredible greed. She had tried to steal my entire kingdom, and she was left with absolutely nothing but a miserable cell of her own making. I thanked Sullivan for his meticulous work and ended the telephone call. I looked out over my blooming rose bushes and felt absolutely no guilt. I did not feel a single sudden surge of fatherly pity for the miserable conditions they were living in. They had built their own prison cells brick by brick, and I was simply the man who finally locked the heavy iron door. Later that same afternoon, I walked down the long concrete driveway to check the metal mailbox. Nestled between the utility bills and the local grocery store flyers was a single white envelope. I immediately recognized the elegant looping handwriting on the front. It was from Brooke. The return address listed the cheap apartment complex Sullivan had just mentioned. The envelope felt thick, undoubtedly filled with multiple pages of desperate apologies and calculated emotional manipulation. I walked slowly back up the driveway, holding the letter in my hand. I walked into my quiet study and sat down at my heavy wooden desk. I looked at the sealed envelope resting on the smooth leather blotter. I knew exactly what words were written on those folded pages inside. She would be begging for a second chance. She would be complaining bitterly about the crushing weight of her retail job and the terrible conditions of her tiny apartment. She would be asking for financial help, pleading with me to use my influence to lower her court-ordered payments so she could breathe. She would try to remind me that she was my only child, hoping to exploit the deep fatherly love she believed still existed in my heart. But she was writing to a ghost. The naive father she remembered had died on a freezing plastic air mattress in a damp basement 6 months ago. I did not reach for my brass letter opener. I did not break the paper seal to read her lies. I simply picked up the thick envelope turned to my right and pressed it firmly into the slot of the heavy-duty electric paper shredder sitting beside my desk. The machine roared to life with a loud mechanical grinding noise. I watched the sharp steel blades instantly catch the white paper, pulling it down and chewing her desperate words into hundreds of tiny, completely unreadable ribbons. The machine stopped, and the room returned to absolute, perfect silence. Some boundaries are completely absolute. True peace requires the total removal of toxic elements from your environment. I emptied the shredded pieces of her letter directly into the trash bin, completely satisfied that I had successfully protected the final years of my life. The sharp smell of fresh wood stain filled the warm air of my garage. For the past 3 weeks, I had dedicated every single morning to a very special project. I stood over my heavy wooden workbench and carefully sanded the final piece of mahogany. When Brooke had ordered the delivery men to throw my beautiful bookshelf to the curb, they had cracked the main supporting beam. It took immense patience to repair the terrible damage. I carefully applied a thick layer of wood glue and clamped the heavy pieces together until they were perfectly solid again. I took a clean cotton cloth and rubbed a dark, rich oil into the grain of the wood. Watching the dull surface come back to life was incredibly satisfying. It felt exactly like repairing my own broken spirit. I had built this furniture 40 years ago with my own 2 hands, and I was incredibly proud to build it a second time. My tools were no longer rusting in the damp grass. They were clean and sharp and safely hanging exactly where they belonged on the wall. By late afternoon, the thick stain had completely dried. I carried the heavy wooden shelves back inside the house one by one. I assembled the beautiful mahogany bookcase in the exact center of my living room. The ugly white minimalist entertainment center my daughter had purchased was long gone. The room finally looked like my home again. I walked over to the small cardboard donation box the restoration crew had rescued from the garage. I reached inside and gently pulled out the vintage first edition novel that belonged to my late wife, Catherine. Brooke had carelessly tossed it away like a piece of worthless garbage. I wiped a thin layer of dust from the colorful cover. I traced my fingers over the embossed gold letters of the title. I walked over to the newly restored mahogany bookshelf and placed the delicate book perfectly in the center of the top shelf. I stood back and looked at the beautiful living room. The warm golden light of the setting sun poured through the front window and illuminated the rich, dark wood. My heart felt incredibly light. The heavy, suffocating burden of the past 2 years was completely gone. I had successfully defended the sacred memory of my beautiful wife and reclaimed the physical space where we had built our long, happy marriage. A house this large, however, is not meant to be completely empty. A few weeks ago, I placed a simple advertisement on the bulletin board of the local university hospital. I was looking for a quiet, respectful tenant to rent the spare guest bedroom. A young medical student named David answered the call. He was an incredibly polite young man who desperately needed a peaceful environment to study for his demanding board exams. He did not come with an arrogant attitude or a massive sense of entitlement. He arrived with 2 heavy suitcases full of thick medical textbooks and a deep sense of gratitude for the affordable rent. I gave him the brass keys to the front door and asked him to simply treat the house with respect. The difference between David and my own daughter was absolutely staggering. David kept his room spotlessly clean. He washed his own dishes immediately after eating his meals. He never played loud music, and he always asked politely before inviting a study partner over for the afternoon. We lived together in perfect harmony. On Saturday mornings, David would take a much-needed break from his heavy studying and join me in the backyard. We would spend hours working side by side in the warm soil of my large garden. He helped me pull the stubborn weeds and plant new rows of bright red tomatoes and sweet green peppers. He told me fascinating stories about his long clinical rotations